Fellowship in Clinical Neuropsychology at South Texas Veterans Healthcare System at the MRGB AHEC Hospital in San Antonio. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Notre Dame in Notre Dame, Indiana. Here to provide you with his program on lifestyle factors to maintain brain health. Please welcome Dr. David Gonzalez, PhD.
See if this works. So can you all hear me okay? I'm pretty soft-spoken actually, so if at any point too you're like, "Hey David, I can't hear you what you're saying," just kind of do a little volume knob turn or raise your thumb up, that would be helpful for me. So it's good so I'm at UT Health in San Antonio. I can kind of hear the sound transitioning a little bit. I'm going to try a different placement for this mic. All right, so essentially what I'm going to be talking about today is different lifestyle strategies to maintain brain health. And this is a topic that is very dear to my heart, not necessarily just this topic, but science literacy and education in general. I grew up actually here in Laredo. I grew up off of kind of Clark Park and close to Martin, but actually went to high school up at the health science magnet at Alexander. And I think that even if you as a person are not a scientist, or even students here aren't planning on entering a science-related profession or health-related profession, the results of these studies impact all of our lives and impact the policy that our representatives make. And having that science literacy is very important to knowing what their options are, what evidence is out there, and knowing what evidence policymakers are making decisions on. So I think what I want to do for today is I want to zoom in and out of a few things. Kind of the broad strokes of what we're doing is I want to briefly just re-review some of the definitions of dementia and Alzheimer's. This has already been detailed before, but repetition is helpful for learning. I want to talk about some of the factors that increase risk, particularly those factors that are modifiable. That's going to be the focus of my talk, because if we look at modifiable risk, then we can turn it around from a positive perspective and say, what are the things that we can do to reduce risk and to maintain brain health? And so I'm going to zoom in and out of studies and then kind of do look at the trees and then look at the forest for some of the current literature on some of these modifiable risk factors and lifestyle strategies. And then at the very end, I want to outline some specific steps that you can take throughout the lifespan. You know, whether you are in middle school right now, whether you are 85 years old, there are different things that you can do to reduce either the risk of developing a dementia or the risk of having the rate of decline for individuals who already have some level of cognitive change. So to start off with dementia, like was mentioned, it's not a specific disease, it's an entity. It's a broad category. And I like to think about about it as a three-parter. Essentially, in dementia, one of the other terms that's used is a major neurocognitive disorder. So sometimes you may see that term used and looking at your doctor's notes or looking at the research literature. It's the same thing, is people are starting to move away from the term dementia somewhat because it does have negative connotations when you consider the roots. Because if you consider the Greek roots, "de" means out of, and "mentia," mente, is mind. So the roots of that are kind of out of one's mind. So there's a movement kind of away from that original term, but they're both interchangeable. But anyway, the three-part definition is you got changes in the brain that can impact your thinking abilities, which can include things like memory, language, spatial cognition. And it impacts those abilities to such an extent that then your ability to live your life is impacted, your day-to-day functioning. The three parts: changes to the brain that impact thinking, that impact your functioning. Now, again, like I was saying, it's a syndrome. There are multiple causes. The two most prevalent causes are Alzheimer's disease and vascular disease. There's, again, kind of a reiteration here of the little umbrella of the umbrella of dementia and different causes. Parkinson's disease would be another cause, FTD, dementia of Lewy bodies. And so, thinking about the specific pathology of the disease, with Alzheimer's disease, what you have is, has already been discussed, you have essentially two main markers of it in the brain. You have some plaques that form and some tangles. So here's an artist's rendition of what a healthy nerve, a nerve cell, a neuron should look like in the brain. You've got the main body that does the processing, and then the long string, the axon that helps different nerves communicate with each other. What can happen, this is an artist's rendition from a pathology textbook, is you have these plaques that can start to form, which can impact the functioning of the main part of the cell. And then these different tangles over it as well. So this is what we see in pathology when we look at the brains of individuals. And so it occurs, Alzheimer's disease occurs in about 2/3 of people who have dementia. So the most prevalent cause of dementia. And it tends to be most common, as we hit older age. So it's most prevalent in our 70s is really when we start to see the risk go up. And when they look at the overall rate of anyone over the age of 65, so from 65 up to 120, about 10% of individuals, so 1 in 10 people will develop some kind or develop Alzheimer's disease once they're over that age range. Vascular disease is another common cause, and even though this is an Alzheimer's Association talk, vascular disease is very important because it can also increase the risk for Alzheimer's disease, as I'll talk about. And the different risk factors for vascular disease are also risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of overlap, and in fact, these two disorders often coexist. You often have what's called a mixed dementia. So 2 or more pathologies. These are some of the 2 most common co-occurring pathologies. And all vascular disease, vascular just means vessels. So heart-related vessels, your arteries, your veins, your capillaries. So disease essentially of the blood vessels. The brain is one of the most energy-hungry organs in the body. It's in charge of everything else that we do. In order to do that, it needs a lot of energy. And so anything that impacts blood flow to the brain significantly impacts its function. And so this can be an acute stroke, but it can also be over time things like having unmanaged high blood pressure, having unmanaged diabetes, can impact those smaller blood vessels, those capillaries, which can lead to chronic microvascular ischemia, meaning chronic over time, microvascular meaning those small arteries, ischemia meaning less oxygen because of less blood flow. And this is what you can, this is someone who has moderate microvascular ischemia. You can see these spots that come up on MRI. These are regions of the brain, particularly in the middle part of the brain, that helps other areas communicate that do not have enough blood flow. So these are the most common changes. And knowing what these changes are will then help us think about what we can do to prevent later on. So it's going to tie into different lifestyle factors that we can do. So we've already kind of talked about some of these risk factors before. It's been talked about before. So age and genetics are 2 big ones. Having low education, having high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, smoking, a major depressive disorder. having very minimal physical activity, having a poor diet, being socially isolated, not having a lot of social contact, having poor sleep, fractured sleep, and having significant sensory loss, including hearing loss, vision loss. And some of you may ask, well, what do you mean by poor diet? What do you mean by physical activity? I'm going to talk about these in more detail later. Okay, but just know that these are general risk factors. Now, another risk factor too that's culturally related is that Latino individuals in the United States are about 50% more likely to develop dementia than non-Hispanic white individuals. So 1.5 times, about 50% more likely. Now, there's a lot of weaknesses in this literature because what does being Latino mean? Especially in our country, it can mean someone from Mexico. Okay, sure, but did they recently immigrate from Spain to Mexico? Is it Spanish heritage, French heritage, Italian heritage? How much mixture is there with indigenous heritage? If indigenous, is it Mexica, Zapotec? Is this someone coming from the Caribbean? It's such a wide swath. It's very unwieldy. And so a lot of these findings, it's kind of unclear what leads to this. Some things that we can point to, as was already mentioned, stress is a big one. A lot of these risk factors that come up for Latinos in this country happen when people, after they've immigrated to the US. And a lot of these conditions aren't as prevalent in the country of origin for recent immigrants. But we know here in the States that you can have increased rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression in the US. However, there's also some strange things. There's something called the Latino paradox, where some of these risk factors may not actually lead to the difficulties that we would expect if they were also present in non-Hispanic whites. So for example, obesity and congestive heart failure may not have all of the same negative effects that it has for other individuals. A big exception is diabetes. That still has that very strong link to brain health. Also, some of the genetic risks may be different too. And this is important because websites like 23andMe, where you can get your own genetic reading, may not mention some of these differences between different groups. But the APOE, that one gene that's been shown to increase risk for dementia, may not be as common in Latino individuals. And even when there, it may not necessarily mean that the risk is much higher. Again, this is based on a handful of studies. Most research is fairly homogeneous, does not include a lot of Latino and Hispanic individuals. So there are also a lot of unanswered questions about what exactly it is about being Hispanic and Latino that can impact brain health. Another thing too, which is not unique to being Latino, even though in the US a lot of people will speak English and Spanish to some extent, but having lifelong, not bilingualism necessarily, multilingualism, any number of languages, may delay the onset of dementia by up to 4 years. And I'll talk about that later when we talk about different things that can impact brain health. So, okay. So we've talked about things that can increase risk. We've talked about things that we have control over, things that we don't have control over. I like referring to this is called the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference. What I want to focus on today is providing some of that wisdom, that knowledge, to help us focus on the things that we do have control over. And so we've talked about risk, but this is again where science literacy is important. What's the evidence for each of these risk factors, and how much does it actually increase risk? That's another very important thing to know. So this is a study that was actually put together by the Alzheimer's Association in 2015. And at the rate that the literature is moving, some of the findings here, the evidence base might be stronger or is stronger for some of these. But they split things up between dementia and cognitive decline. And again, the difference, cognitive decline, any changes that can be measured in memory, language abilities, spatial abilities, versus dementia is a very specific syndrome where you have severe cognitive changes that then start to impact day-to-day functioning. So they do make this distinction, because a lot of times in research it can be easier to measure this, because you can just give a few separate tests as opposed to a whole workup that would lead to a diagnosis of dementia and a specific syndrome. That being said, we can see again that there's very strong evidence. So again, blue, higher arrow means stronger evidence for a history of traumatic brain injury, obesity in midlife, hypertension in midlife, currently smoking, diabetes. We can see too people who have more formal education or more physically active, who follow the Mediterranean diet in particular, who maintain cognitive activity or participate in cognitive training at a decreased risk. And all of these have strong to moderate evidence for helping reduce the rate of cognitive decline. And a lot of these same factors then translate over to dementia. But again, it's a little bit harder to do dementia research or to use dementia as an outcome because more is required to get this, to know that someone has that. So we see these same things over here, and we see the same things over here. So this is the strength of the evidence. Now, how much does it actually impact risk? So this study was alluded to as well. So it's in the Lancet, very not prevalent, but a very important, impactful journal in science. For those of you that are providers or medical providers, I really would recommend reading this. The Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care it came out last year. It does a beautiful job of summarizing the current state of the evidence across initial diagnosis, reducing risk, to then what do we do when someone actually already has dementia. So I really recommend this paper. One of the really neat things that they did is that they looked at what's the extent of risk that some of these different factors cause, how prevalent are they in the population, and they did something that's called a population attributable factor to essentially determine how many cases of dementia can be reduced if we were to completely eliminate some of these factors. And small to see over here, but you can essentially see that there are things to do in early life, in midlife, and late life. In this next slide, I zoom in a little bit. So you can see over here that combining all of these modifiable things, which I've already talked about, means that up to a third of cases of dementia at any given point could be eliminated if all of these factors were completely eliminated. And one of the powerful things is that some of these things, like education, actually has more of an effect than genetics, the APOE allele. So there's a lot of control that we have in our lives. To kind of put it in context, the current estimates of a little over 5 million individuals having dementia. If we were to reduce a third of those, that would be 2 million less people, more or less, having cases of dementia if we were to address these factors. So there is a lot that we can do, and actually, even though it's not the majority of the effect, it's a very significant amount. So there's a lot that we have power over. Okay. So even if we don't completely understand why the disease forms, we know that there are things that increase risk. We know the amount of risk that they contribute to. So we can start doing things to reduce that risk. We have a path to prevention. For example, even before we knew about viruses and bacteria, scientists were already learning that washing their hands reduced the risk of infections. They didn't know why yet. That mechanism wasn't there, the science wasn't there. But by observing, by looking at relationships, we're able to say we can do these things that can reduce the risk of a disease even if we don't completely understand why it happens. And that's where we're at right now with dementia and Alzheimer's. And so here's a nice model that talks about why some of these things may increase risk and why addressing them may decrease risk. So it's currently believed that some of these plaques and tangles may form over time as we have small level brain damage and inflammation happening over time. Things like stress, particularly chronic stress, is associated with certain stress hormones, which are actually neurotoxic when they stay in the body for long. Now, stress at one point is okay, but if you have repeated chronic stress, you have a buildup of these stress hormones, which can be neurotoxic. Other things like diabetes, hypertension can also lead to small vascular damage. So these things that might be contributing to the buildup of these plaques and tangles, we can address over here. Again, brain inflammation, which can be related to some of these causes as well. And then education, hearing training, all of that can help increase cognitive reserve. Now, what cognitive reserve is think about the brain processes things. and it helps different areas communicate with each other, kind of like a highway. What cognitive reserve does is it increases lanes in the highway, so that even if someone has a certain lane breaks down, there's a car, stops on the road, that lane is closed, there are extra lanes for the brain to say, okay, well, we're going to do a detour, go around, to where even if there's actually brain damage, it doesn't actually lead to changes in people's thinking abilities and functioning, but they're able to work around that observable damage. And so that's what cognitive reserve does. It increases the lanes of the brain's highways. And so, again, what is dementia? Changes to the brain, that change thinking, that impact day-to-day functioning. So currently our preventative pathways can work on either helping limit changes to the brain, diet and exercise are one way of doing that, and impact, even if there are changes, we can change whether or not those changes actually impact our thinking abilities by having things like education, cognitive training to increase that cognitive reserve. Dr. Mitzi Gonzalez will be talking about different strategies that you can use to then change this link to someone that has cognitive changes. How can we increase their functioning even if there have been changes in their thinking? So we can kind of stop this at different phases where people's lives are able to be more fulfilling. So given the amount of time that I have, which is not a whole lot, and the amount of literature that we have, which is a lot, and I have until 12:30, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So given the amount of literature and evidence out there in time, I'm going to focus on 3 particular lifestyle factors that have a strong amount of evidence. And again, I'm going to zoom in and out with regard to the literature, specific studies, broad strokes. I'm going to focus on physical activity. I'm going to focus on healthy diet. I'm going to focus on cognitive stimulation challenge. I might have neck pains after this. Okay, so that's good. All right. And also, too, if anyone actually has questions in the agenda that we have, there's a little notes page. So any questions that come up, just jot them down there. If there's a slide that you want to take a picture of, say, hey, we can go back to this slide over here. That way we can talk about it over the little form that we're going to have after this. So physical activity. This is one particular study, the Framingham Park study, which is a small town in Massachusetts, kind of closest to Boston. I do also want to point out that the new director of the Biggs Alzheimer's Institute came down from Boston University, Sudhasha Chandri, and she's the new director of the Alzheimer's Institute, a world-leading researcher in the field. And this is a really neat study because they enrolled multiple generations of people up in Massachusetts and followed them over years. This particular study that came out of that larger Framingham study looked at 3,700 individuals over the age of 60. And so for those of you students, whenever you have a study that has more people in it, there's generally the findings are more robust. So this is good. The more individuals that we have, that means that you can be sure about the conclusions of the study. There's less variability, less likely for there to be error. What they did is they followed these people over 10 years. And they looked at overall, what do they report doing that day? So they had a rating scale for different kinds of activities. On the very bottom, sleeping, going all the way up to physically strenuous activity. And they looked at typical hours in a day, how many hours are being spent in these different kinds of activities. They then looked at how many people developed dementia over time as they were following this population. And they measured their brain volume. What they found, and actually, so what they did is they broke people up into 5 different levels of activity. And people who are at the lowest level, the lowest quintile, it's called. Quintile, C14, 5. The people at that lowest one had a 47% higher chance of developing dementia over the 10-year period. So you can kind of see that picture in this graph here. They broke it down between any cause of dementia and then Alzheimer's disease in particular. And what's interesting is that the effect for physical activity seems to grow over time. This group here at the top, it was essentially, flojos, they weren't really doing anything, not a whole lot of activity, had a much higher risk of developing dementia. They had higher dementia rates than those in the bottom graph, the bottom 4 bits. So you can see, and that changes over time. The same thing for Alzheimer's disease. It's not as strong as for other causes of dementia, but it's still a significant effect. Another thing, too, that was very interesting is that we're actually seeing changes in the brain. So this essentially looked at the people, again, breaking it down, the activity levels into 5 pieces. This is the least active, these are the most active people, so first quintile, fifth quintile. And they looked at total cerebral brain volume, so the overall size of the brain. And they looked at, this is hippocampal volume, which is a part of the inside of the brain that's in charge of our memories. And what they found is that over time, people who were most active had significantly larger brains. And that's even for control. You could say, well, maybe these people in the lows had to have a stroke, so they couldn't move. They controlled for that. They controlled for how old they were. Because as we get older, there can be natural shrinkage of our brain. They controlled for that factor too. They controlled for a number of other diseases. And even when doing that, all of the things make people be more active. People had larger brains in general. And in particular, the part of the brain in charge of memory itself was larger. So very strong evidence for physical activity not only impacting dementia rates, but our brain directly. Now, this is just one study. And so, again, this is for the students out there. Generally, even if a study is really, really strong, it's still just one study. Every study was done in one particular place, with one particular kind of methods, with a particular kind of population. If you try doing that same thing with other people in another part of the country with a slightly different method, you may have different results. And so there's something that's called a meta-analysis, which is essentially a study of studies. What they do is they say, okay, is this a true relationship? If I take all these different studies that were done with different people in different places with slightly different techniques, are we still seeing that relationship? The short answer is yes. So in following people over time, what we see is that there's a significantly reduced risk of dementia. Now, in particular, and is that a little bit better? Trying to find my specific notes here. So what they did with this study.
Would you like to go to your handheld?
I think if I move this around a little bit. I'll try doing this for now. I'll keep on with this. I'll try not to do this much. It's my fault for keeping it as simple. So essentially what they found with this is that you had overall the, I'm going to stand over here because my neck has to turn this way from the microphone. So again, we have a split between cognitive decline and dementia. Okay, so they analyze it differently. They studies look at cognitive decline or dementia. And what they see is across all these different studies, over tens of thousands of people are included by looking at all of these studies. What they found is that people who are more physically active, there is a 35% less risk of developing any sort of cognitive decline. And this is following people over 2 years, all the way up to 25 years. There's a long time follow-up range that they had in these studies. And looking at dementia in particular, again, following over whether it was 2 up to 25 years, we saw a 14% reduction in the rate of dementia, the incidence of dementia. So even looking at across a whole range of studies, there is this very strong link. Now again, longitudinal studies are not the gold standard of causation. For that, we need something that's called a randomized controlled trial, where we can say, because it could be one possible explanation going back. Could be that maybe there's something about people who are more active to begin with. Maybe to start off with, they have less risk for dementia. That's why they start doing more physical activity. That's a possibility. We can't rule it out with these kinds of studies, that there could be something different about these people even going into the groups. So randomized controlled trial eliminates that. It says all things being equal, we'll randomly put people in different groups, and we'll determine, does doing exercise actually lead to changes which are worthwhile? And essentially this is a proof of concept. We looked at a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials, and we see measurable changes in thinking abilities, so attention processing speed, ability to plan organize, and memory. cut off over here, but memory as well. These are small improvements, but they're still measurable and present. So it's not an improvement to where if you start doing exercise, you may notice, oh my gosh, super memory now. But there is a measurable improvement in adults at all ages. This is including people in their 20s up to their 80s. Now, is this true then? So this is all adults. What we see is that physical activity is actually more helpful for individuals who already have cognitive impairment, dementia. Again, randomized controlled trials, this is a meta-analysis, so across a whole bunch of different studies. What they've seen is that these are clinically significant sizes. These are things, again, you're not going to, remember, it's not going to be a lot. It's not going to be super memory, but there can be measurable improvements over a period of time. And this is exercise ranging from 1 month to 6 months that they were looking at in these studies. So very short term, what we're seeing is that either aerobic-only exercise was helpful for improving their thinking abilities, and controlled aerobic and non-aerobic exercise was also helpful. Non-aerobic on its own, at least in this synthesis, was not as helpful. It's important to see that we're seeing these effects even because going back, we can see that the beneficial effects of exercise seem to be exponential. Over time, it seems to have more protective effect. So the fact that in randomized controlled trials, which are done over short periods, we're seeing these positive effects, it is quite frankly astounding to see that you can see such improvement in your brain thinking over something that seems so simple and mundane. So, physical activity. Next, I want to go into diet. We already, with that Alzheimer's study that I presented, is already a little preview here. The Mediterranean diet is one that seems to have a lot of evidence for it. I say Mediterranean, just mean foods that were historically typical of places like Greece, Italy, South Spain, where the Mediterranean diet is here in the middle. I'm going to talk about some of these other diets in a little bit. It essentially means what you're doing is you're having less red meat, you're having more things like fish for protein, less chicken, you're having a higher proportion of unrefined grains, whole grains, more veggies, you're having olive oil instead of something like canola, you're having some olive oil in there. A lot of people seem to like this, alcohol, but again, notice that it's got less than and greater than NO2. So you can't be having, more than 300 milliliters, which is a pretty small amount daily. So this isn't an excuse to go and get your Bud Light with your friends. It's a very limited amount of alcohol. It does seem to have some protective effects. And so let's look at the evidence for this. Again, this is a meta-analysis that we have here. And they looked at the Mediterranean diet. And this included over 8,000 people from different parts of the world who were followed with this diet for anywhere from 2 to 5 years in different studies. And what they found is that they looked at overall the Mediterranean diet continuously, meaning that someone's saying, oh, okay, maybe I'll still have a lot of chicken, but I'm going to have some more veggies too. So just kind of middle of the road, not taking the full Mediterranean diet into account. They found, so middle of the road, test, but actually it's started with that. This can pick me up and fail do that. Okay, I'll try this as well. Okay. All right. So I think this one it looked, so using it as a continuous variable, what they found is that it somewhat reduced the risk, so people were kind of middle of the road about it. We saw that there was about 8% reduction in the incidence, and this is of any cognitive impairment. So there was mild cognitive impairment or severe enough to be a dementia, what they found is that there's about 8% reduction in risk, people doing it middle of the road. But when they broke it up to people who, 100% were following the diet compared to those who were not doing the diet at all, what we saw is that there was a 33% reduction in the risk of any cognitive impairment. So it seems that, at least with the Mediterranean diet, most of its effects seem to come from really following it the whole way, kind of following all of its recommendations. And so the Mediterranean diet is based on a diet that's been typical to a region for centuries. We've developed research since then. We can look at different micronutrients, we can look at specific food profiles to see are there any things that are particularly healthy for the brain. And based on the results of those research, this new diet was proposed called the MIND diet. Now MIND is an acronym, it stands for the Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. Kind of a mouthful, MIND diet just kind of rolls off the tongue. What they did is they took the Mediterranean diet and said, okay, there's newer research about certain foods that are good for the brain and certain foods that are not as good for the brain. So let's take that Mediterranean diet and then add a few other things and take things away and see how it works out. And with this, what they did is they followed about 1,000 people. And this is based out of Chicago, this study at Rush University. And they followed them on average for about 5 years for people, even though some people went up to 10 years in the study. And this was published 2 years ago, 3 years ago. What they found is that people who, and they broke people up into 3 groups. So those who were really following the MIND diet, those who were kind of middle of the road, and those who are just like, nah, I really like my burgers, for me that's what I want. It's people who are not following the diet at all. And what they found is that there were significant differences across all 3 groups with regard to their overall cognitive abilities. So as people were aging, there were declines in general, but the declines were much more pronounced in those who were not following any of the MIND diet recommendations, versus we still saw significant improvements for those who went middle of the road. We're like, well, I don't want to give everything up, but I'll at least do some of these changes. And this was true not only just for global cognition, but for every single part of thinking abilities in particular. Memory, both for more recent things as opposed to more knowledge, perceptual abilities, how quickly you can process things, and how much you can focus on at one time. Significant, even when controlling for diseases, maybe it was people who weren't following the diet and had some diseases that got in the way of them doing that. Maybe was it age? They controlled for all those factors and still saw very significant effects. Again, this is just for cognition. They also followed people with regard to developing dementia. So this is essentially, you can think about it as over here, this is the amount of people with who do not have dementia, which is most everyone at the enrollment of it. And then over time, you can see their trajectories change, where essentially lower means that you have more people developing dementia. And they compared 3 different diets. They compared this new MIND diet, they compared the Mediterranean diet, and they compared the DASH diet, which is this hypertension diet. It stands for dietary approaches to stop hypertension or to address systolic hypertension, are the 2 terms that I've seen. And while they all had positive effects on the development of dementia, what's key to note is that kind of like what we saw with that meta-analysis is that you really have to follow the Mediterranean diet. This top line is people who really followed that diet, the black line is people who are middle of the road, and then the dashed line is those who did not follow it at all. Really, in order for there to be a benefit in the incidence of dementia, people had to really follow the diet. Same thing for the DASH diet. Versus with the MIND diet, people could be middle of the road and still experience less incidence of dementia than those who did not follow any of the recommendations. So what's really good about this is that it's really hard to change what we do, especially if we have decades of eating a certain way, certain things that we like. So what's really nice about this is that even slight changes in that can help reduce the risk. And I'll have another slide that actually talks about the MIND diet in a little bit more detail at the end of it for recommendations for those that have questions about that. So the last thing that I want to touch on is cognitive activity. Now there are actually a few different ways that this can be split up in the literature. One is maintaining cognitively challenging activities throughout your lifespan. And this is one study, another meta-analysis, and they looked at different things that lead to cognitive reserve. So again, reserve is extra lanes in the highway of the brain, so that even if you have damage, your brain can compensate, reroute to where it's actually not impacting thinking as much. And so they looked at education, very significant effect. They looked at people who had challenging occupations, it also had a protective effect. Which this is also just as a side note, this is important to know because sometimes people may say, I had a really challenging job, it must have tired my brain, and that's why I developed dementia. If you have a job that requires challenge, but you're not experiencing chronic stress over that, that's actually protective, because you're essentially, think about it as working out your brain. And then what's important for me, what I want to focus on is leisure activity. And what they found is that people who maintain these activities through old age had about a 40% reduction in dementia risk over time. Now, what are things that are considered cognitively stimulating? This could be like any hobby. It could be knitting, it could be playing an instrument, practicing an instrument. It could be games like chess, cards, crossword puzzles, visiting friends, relatives, community work, volunteer work, reading. Now, I want to focus on actively. Not having TV in the background isn't going to change risk or anything. So actively engaging with that. So say a news program, we're trying to keep track of what's been going on, or a documentary, anything that's more challenging that requires active participation. Listening to something like NPR, where there's active participation of listening, or those who like music, who are listening to the different melodies and timbre. Again, it's this active listening and active watching. We saw a significant reduction. But again, this isn't a randomized controlled trial, so we don't know if this is causing it. It could be that maybe the people who are already doing lots of these activities already had more perfected brains to begin with, which is why we're seeing less of a risk. But still, over time, we're seeing very positive effects. So, as opposed to having a lifestyle, what about cognitive training? Cognitive training could mean something like learning different memory skills, different reasoning skills. It's not necessarily playing some of those brain games, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, but more so actually receiving training on some different strategies for thinking abilities. What they found is that training, and this is a meta-analysis of different randomized controlled trials. So again, across different studies, different groups, highest level of evidence with RCTs. A lot of these individual studies were smaller, so they only had about 1,800 people in total. What they found conclusively is that training can improve performance in a specific area, meaning that if you have training in memory, your memory might get better for that particular task. However, it may not transfer to other areas in your day-to-day life. So people may be better on essentially just playing the one game that they were doing, or the one task that they're doing. Say you got trained on how to remember people's names when you first meet them. You might be really good at doing that one thing, but it may not transfer to anything else that's also memory related. Just say you get a really good strategy for helping remember your grocery items. You like chunking them into categories. That may not generalize to other areas, it may be specific to that one area you were trained in. So even though it improves that area, for the most part, it does not seem to transfer to other areas or people's day-to-day lives. However, these 2 points about simulating activities and generalization, what they noted in this meta-analysis was that the evidence is currently lacking. So what they really said is kind of a call to arms. We need more research that really addresses these other areas, because a lot of the studies on cognitive training have really just looked at essentially the similar tests that they're training people on. So it's almost like training for the test or something. So this is one thing to keep in mind. This is one particularly strong study, the ACTIVE study. So ACTIVE is Advanced Cognitive Training for Independent and Vital Elderly. And what they did is they did training of these particular areas. So they broke people up into 3 areas. It's a really small graph, I'm sorry. But essentially they trained people in memory, in reasoning abilities, and in speed of processing strategies. And they had a fourth group that did not receive any training whatsoever. And what you can see over 10 years is essentially what the meta-analysis suggested. So people who receive training in memory, they improve in their memory abilities in the short term, and the long term, keeping those strategies, that particular ability seemed strong, but it didn't impact any of the other areas. People who got trained in reasoning, their reasoning went up versus people in the other groups didn't. That seemed to stay stronger while declining over time. Again, speed of processing strategies that really went up for this one particular group, but then didn't for any of the other groups and went down over time. So again, training only really improves the area that you're being trained in. And this other graph looked at people's reported functioning. So how much they're participating in managing their finances, in transportation, in managing their medications and healthcare. And what's really telling about this is that even though we saw improvement in the specific area that was being trained in, there wasn't really an improvement in functioning over time. Although the people who did have some sort of training, particularly speed training and reasoning training, seemed to have slightly better functioning in the long term than people who had no training whatsoever. So somewhat promising finding, but again, a single study, some more research is needed. Now, it's really important to keep this in mind because a lot of people are scared of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And whenever there's a fear, you're going to have con artists trying to exploit that. And yeah, I'm not saying that, for example, that Lumosity, I'm not saying that they're con artists, but they may overextend, they may oversell their product. So some of you may have heard about this, but they settled a lawsuit a couple of years ago, in 2016. They had to pay $2 million for deceptive advertising. What they were claiming is that participating in their brain training program led to improvement in schoolwork, athletics, that it delayed age-related mental decline and protected against dementia and Alzheimer's, that it helped people with PTSD, TBI, and other health conditions. We can see from the literature it's not true. Sure, there can be an improvement in one area that you were trained in, but you're training to test. Right now, we do not have the evidence to say that it extends to other parts of our lives, despite claims to the contrary with some of these companies. And so, again, look out for this. And really, I want to highlight the importance of doing anything that's challenging and new, because you don't have to pay an expensive program that has maybe bogus effects when playing Super Mario could lead to cognitive challenge and be helpful. So once I looked at younger adults, so people in their 20s, but these are people who had never been exposed to this particular video game. And again, the idea is that any sort of challenge, something that's new that you haven't been exposed to before, again, this falls under, I was talking about lifestyle things, playing games. Again, something that's challenging, learn something new, keep track of new things. What they found is that there are actually changes in the brain related to movement coordination, related to spatial memory. Spatial memory, they changed the conventions here. And also related to the part of the brain involved in planning strategies. So again, anything that's challenging can have positive effects if you maintain it in your life. Again, this thing, Mario, isn't going to prevent dementia. This is just, I wanted to use that to highlight the fact that you don't need to pay some expensive program in order to get benefits. There are multiple ways to have challenge in your life. And so, I talked about all of these things individually, but there's some research suggesting that combining all of these different lifestyle strategies might actually enhance their effects. So, partaking in regular physical activity might enhance the effect of this cognitive training or diet. They might all come together to have even more positive effects than each one would have on its own. And this study was already alluded to, the finger study, the Finnish geriatric study. And I thought it was really funny that the US extension is called Pointer. Whoever came up with that name needs a prize. But yes, so there's initial research suggesting that combining these may have more positive effects than each one on its own. Which then leads me to say, okay, well, wait a minute, we talk about all these different things, but what should I do? What can I do in my life? And so what we can do is We know that physical activity, we know that healthy diet, and we know that maintaining cognitive challenge throughout your life are important things to help reduce risk. So what you can do is you can do an honest assessment of where you are right now. How much physical activity do I actually have in my life? And honestly, that first step can be the hardest step. To really come face to face with, what am I eating, how much activity am I doing? If we actually sit down and kind of track hour through hour, you'd be surprised about what the data shows you. But once you know where you are, you know how to move forward. And you can use something like a smartphone. Have a very specific goal. Say, I want to start eating this instead of this. Now, something that can help you come up with a specific aim is the American Heart Association came up with like Simple 7. What's interesting is that this was initially created for heart health, but studies have shown that following these Simple 7 actually also helps maintain brain health. Which makes sense because we talked about how blood pressure increases risk for dementia. We talked about how physical activity, lack of, increases risk for dementia. We talked about how healthy diet reduces the risk for dementia. We talked about how obesity can impact the risk for dementia. We talked about smoking. So all of these things that are good for your heart are also good for your brain. And if you want even more specific goals, they actually break down the Simple 7 into this really helpful table that looks at smoking, looks at BMI, looks at PA's physical activity, looks at healthy diet components, and I'll talk about some of those components in the next slide. Talks about cholesterol aims, although it does seem to have an impact on brain health, but it's not as strong as some of these other things, but it's important for heart health. Has specific blood pressure recommendations, and then kind of different blood sugar recommendations as well. So what it does is it kind of breaks it up into 3 groups. So if we're talking about physical activity, what's something to aim for? About 150 minutes a week of moderate physical activity. So with this, essentially, if you break this down, could be half an hour of something that's moderately strenuous. Something that for you as a person builds up a sweat, where you feel that your heart is starting to beat a little bit faster, something moderately strenuous. That half an hour, 5 times a week, would be at the ideal metric for physical activity for reducing the risk of some difficulties. And they have specific metrics for blood pressure, glucose. So this is a really helpful resource for coming up with what is something specific that I can do in my life to aim for to reduce the risk of any cognitive changes. Now, with regard to diet components, this is the components of the MIND diet. And so on the left over here, they have the broad categories along with recommendations. So 0 is bad. This is the group of people that study who are not following it at all. If they got 0s across all of these different areas. And then 1 is very good. This is someone who's extremely following the diet very closely. And over here on the right is kind of details a little bit more about some of these things. So when they say over here, for example, red meat products, you might say, oh, burger's not red meat. No, sorry, cheeseburger, first thing on that list over here for red meat products. And again, it's not about not having it at all. People who completely follow the diet, they just have it for less than 4 meals a week. So again, this, and it goes through again the amount of vegetables to aim for. Green leafy ones in particular seem to have some particularly protective factors. Berries, nuts, particularly walnuts, olive oil, people who are using butter more often, again, a higher risk, not as good with the diet. Cheese, whole grains, fish, not fried, sorry. Beans, chicken, again, fast fried foods, pastries and sweets, which would include sugary drinks as well. And my diet focuses on wine as opposed to any alcohol. And again, if you're having more than a glass, not so good. If you're having kind of no alcohol at all, there's something protected about alcohol. And if it's going to be part of it afterwards, you're going to happy hour. And aim for 1 glass a day. So this is, again, something specific to aim for. So again, what I've done today is I've reviewed things that but contribute to increased risk for cognitive impairment and dementia. I really focus on 3 things that have substantial evidence. That's physical activity, healthy diet, and maintaining cognitively stimulating activities. And if you want to incorporate these in your lives, create a SMART. Come up with something specific. You can use some of Life Simple 7s and the Mind Diet to come up with specific aims for you. Again, you have to look at where you are and come up with, come up with something that's realistic for you. It's going to be based on where you are. You need to find then something, this is something I can actually achieve on my own. And set a specific time frame. Not like, oh, I'm going to do this whenever. Within a month, I'm going to, cut down my cheeseburgers from 7 times a week to 5 times a week. So have a specific time frame for your specific goals. And these are just other resources. So the National Institute on Aging, they have a Go for Life program, which has different physical activities, where sometimes people who may have movement limitations, they may say, oh, I can't walk, that's it, I can't do any exercise. But they actually have a lot of really great resources for those who even have mobility limitations, different chair exercises that you can do to maintain that physical activity. So this is a really great program we're looking to online. The American Heart and Stroke Association, they have a brain health webpage, highlighted unfortunately, brainhealth.strokeassociation.org. Kind of summarizes some of those Life Simple 7s in there as well. And then for those of you that are providers, the American Congress of Rehab Medicine, they actually have physical activity recommendations for the aging brain. It's a clinician-patient guide, so to help kind of individuals plan for physical activity that would be appropriate for where they're at. But that's what we went over today. I hope you're able to take something with you to increase the health of your brain and your life. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. I appreciate that. He really ruined lunch for me. Jeez, I was going to go to Whataburger. I guess I'm not going anymore because I'm going to start eating conscientiously.
Small steps, small steps.
With that said, we do want to, Mark, would you help me with this? I do want to acknowledge, of course, our platinum sponsor, Bright Star Care. Anybody from Bright Star here? Raise your hand. Stand up, in fact. People, give them a big hand. They did a fantastic job. We actually have a commercial of theirs that we want to show you.
Mom started searching for her words, and my brother Ray and I started searching for answers.
When it's time to navigate in-home care, follow that Bright Star. Because Bright Star Care earns the same accreditation as the best hospitals. And Bright Star Care means RN will customize a plan that evolves with Mom's changing needs.
Because Dad made us promise we'd keep Mom at home.
Call 844-4-BRIGHT-STAR for your free home care planning guide.
Awesome. So if you want to talk to somebody in the back, please make sure you visit their booth. We appreciate that. Thank you very much. We are going to break for lunch. I do have a couple of rules I want to go over if you don't mind. And the lunch is a healthy chicken, turkey, and ham. So leave me some turkey, please. We're going to have you go out these doors right here, and then go out to the right, my right, and then come out back in here. We are going to have a panel. We're going to ask our speakers to please come back up front, and while we're eating, we are going to have our discussion. So if anybody who wrote down your questions, now's going to be the time to ask, okay? So let's go ahead and go out the back doors, okay? We'll come out back in these doors, and then we'll get started with our question and answer session.